Hello, my name is John Henry Fitzgerald. I'm part of the E3 team, and I'm here to teach you a quick lesson on the basics of API authentication in the context of Alteryx. First, I'll note that some APIs are able to be connected to without any authentication at all. This is generally in the case where the API is available publicly for free and no tracking is done on their end. An example of this would be the 7-timer weather API. Another is the API used in the download tool troubleshooting video. Next, we have HTTP basic authentication. This is essentially just taking a username and password, combining them, and basically coding that and sending it in an authorization header. This is deprecated in most secure APIs because simply base64 encoding credentials isn't particularly secure. Here is a diagram showing the standard handshake for basic auth. Essentially, you first try and reach out without authorization credentials, get a 401 error, and then send the basic credentials. And if the server accepts it, then you're authenticated. Here we have an implementation of basic authentication in an Alteryx workflow. We take in username and password, combine them, base64 encode them, add basic and make the field called authorization, and then add the authorization field as a header. We send this and we get a successful authentication. This is just a test API, so it doesn't contain any meaningful information. Now, it's really important to note here that while we do have users that use this exact method to authenticate with their servers, this is not secure at all. Especially in this case where we're using the text input tool, the username and password are in plain text in the workflow XML. This is not really okay. And if we see users using this, we need to make them aware that they can actually accomplish this using DCM now. So now I'm going to pop over to a newer version of Alteryx, and you can see here I have already set up username and password credentials in DCM here. And so if I use those, I can still run the workflow. And actually, since the download tool is built to only make a single request, it's showing the 401 response. But you see we're actually authenticating and getting a full response from the server. So in the download data. So we'll head over to Fiddler to get a closer look at what's happening there. Now, if we look at the Fiddler trace for both of those workflows, we see the first time there was just the one request because the workflow was built with just a single download tool to send the authorization header in a single request. And notice that it actually also applied proxy authorization headers. This is due to my user settings, which apply proxy credentials. Now, in the case where we use DCM, there's actually a 401 error the first time it attempts to connect, and that's because it's doing really the correct basic authentication step, which is to reach out without credentials and then get rejected. And in the response, we'll see a www authenticate header, which requests basic authentication if that's the auth type that the external server supports. And then the download tool reaches out with the authorization header. And notice since no proxy credentials were requested, we didn't need to send those. One last very important note about HTTP basic authentication is that it's not very secure. So with this in mind, if you're using basic authentication, it's very important to update your passwords very frequently and always use HTTPS, not just HTTP, to ensure that requests are TLS encrypted in transit. Many major APIs have actually already deprecated basic authentication. And here at the bottom of this slide, I've linked a statement from Microsoft about the risks of basic auth and why they deprecated it for their Exchange API. So please feel free to refer to slides after you're watching the video. Another authentication method to be aware of is API key authentication. It's very similar to basic auth. However, instead of using the authorization header, it uses the X API key header. And instead of a base64 encoded username and password, it's just an API key. So you can see in this Postman screenshot, we just apply the X API key header here. Using curl, you just apply the -H option to add a header and add the X API key demo key there. replacing demo key with an actual API key. This is very similar to basic auth. However, it's a little too similar. It's subject to almost all of the same security risks that I just stated. The only thing that's different is that the API key can only be used to access API endpoints, so it can't be used to log into a GUI somewhere. So in that sense, it's a little bit more secure, since if someone were to get their hands on your API key, it would be a little bit more restricted what they could do with it. Now, I'd just like to note that API key authentication isn't exactly a standardized request format. Even in the example of that specific nrel.gov API that we were just looking at, we were able to authenticate using the XAPI key header. However, we also could have applied the API key as a URL parameter, as you see here, or even as part of the base URL. This isn't true of all APIs that use API key authentication. The important thing to keep in mind, and this is across all authentication methods, API key is just one example. The important thing to keep in mind is that you must pay attention to the documentation for the API you're working with to understand the correct format for the requests. Now, the next authentication method I'd like to talk about, and the first one that we'll really see a lot in Alteryx connectors, is called bearer token authentication. The way this works is there's typically some kind of standardized process for acquiring a token known as a bearer token, and then this bearer token can be used very similarly to an API key to interact with a resource server until it expires, at which point you then need to restart the process to get a new token in order to continue interacting with that server. For an example of bearer token authentication, we can look at the provide access token authentication method in the box input tool. Here I'm using version 2.5. I've generated a developer token via the box UI and entered it here as the access token. Now I'm going to go to Fiddler, go to File, Capture Traffic, and back to Designer, click Connect, and browse to select my file, run the workflow. And then we'll go to Fiddler, stop capturing traffic. Now, in this Fiddler trace, the first connection we see to box.com is a series of requests that appear to be going through folders and selecting the file that I needed. Now, a nifty thing Alteryx did was it kept my previous selections cached because I had set up that workflow before recording. But it still made all those same requests to Box to confirm that those items existed in the same place. And with each request, we see the authorization header stating bearer authentication and including my developer token. Now, for those of you concerned about information security, which is hopefully all of you, you might be concerned that this is in the video. However, this is a developer token and it expires after 1 hour, so it will not be usable by the time this video is available. Now, if we look later in the trace, we can see what happens when the workflow is run. First, we see a connect to api.box.com, setting up a secure tunnel so that the response can be sent via HTTPS. So this is normally an encrypted response that I've already decrypted. Now, just to give you an idea of what that looks like, you can see this is an example of one that's still encoded. Click to decode. Fiddler does that for us. Now, in our request to api.box.com, we can still see that bearer authentication is being used, the same bearer token. And the response includes a link to public.boxcloud.com, which will actually contain the contents of our file. So then we set up a secure tunnel to public.boxcloud.com and access that URL. And that's where we're actually getting the data here. We can see it's already decoded. And this is the data that was pulled into the workflow. Finally, we see some additional requests to api.box.com. This is because after running the workflow, since the box tool was selected, the UI reloaded, which included a couple more requests, again using the same cached access token. Now, there's some very clear similarities between bearer token authentication and basic authentication and API key authentication that might make one wonder why bearer tokens exist in the first place. Well, bearer tokens were created to be part of the OAuth 2.0 framework. Now, this is a much more standardized and sophisticated method for authentication over HTTP, and OAuth is really the method that we're going to see in most Alteryx connectors. The key with OAuth is that you are actually creating or getting your access token in your initial authentication request using different credentials and authenticating with a separate OAuth server. Then using that access token to authenticate with the resource server, which separately communicates with the OAuth server to make sure that your traffic is legit. OAuth is very important in HTTP authentication, especially with respect to Alteryx, and so we're going to have a separate video to focus on just that. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this helpful, and please send any questions or feedback you may have to the E3 team. We'd be happy to hear from you.